This is my letter to the call for information for the torture report, for another torture report, a follow-up, another sub-report or committee report, whatever it is. And I'm not going to read you the call for information. And what we call them where I work is an RFI. What the UN put out is an RFI. That's the nomenclature or the acronym, and that stands for Request for Information. You know, sometimes different kinds of entities put out requests for information to gather stakeholder input. So I recognize this, and I wrote a response that capitalized on my experience with RFIs. Okay, so this is addressed to Professor Niels Meltzer, dated 21 June 2020, and it's addressed to him as the Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. That's in the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and then I give the address in Geneva, Switzerland. And then it is the subject regarding response to RFI for report on psychosocial dynamics conducive to torture. And then I put in brackets, because I wanted to make sure that they knew that I got it in on time. It said submitted 21 June 2020 at 11:30 p.m. local time, 2,000 words total. Okay, and it was 2,000 words total, including everything, the header, the salutation, everything, and even the captions. And that was the limit, 2,000 words. So even the date, everything came up to 2,000 words. Dear Professor Meltzer, I am submitting this response to your request for information on behalf of a grassroots human rights organization known as FFTI. This is a joint response from me and Mrs. Ella Free. She and I are the co-founders of FFTI and serve as FFTI's president and vice president, respectively. We are stakeholders in the psychosocial dynamics conducive to torture, as well as recommended measures to prevent and mitigate torture for the following reasons. Our organization engages with and advocates for approximately 15,000 people in the USA and other countries who allege being victims of organized stalking and harassment, remotely delivered directed energy assaults, and related forms of persecution and ill treatment. Here I'm borrowing language from their call for information. I borrowed language from it. I used the same language that they were using in some regards. A sizable proportion of the victims we engage with have shared and documented accounts of abuse ranging from psychological harassment to bona fide psychological and physical torture with directional energy emitting devices. In addition, Mrs. Free and I have firsthand experience as torture victims, which is what motivated us to engage in victim support and advocacy work. I was tortured by technology-assisted harassment and energy weapon assaults from 1 October 2013 to 28 January 2016 in Vancouver, Canada, presumably because I witnessed criminal activity in a non-residential building next to my apartment. Mrs. Free is an ongoing victim of these forms of abuse, apparently because she rejected the advances of a wealthy would-be paramour with connections to the high-tech industry. Consequently, we have firsthand expertise in these matters and a wealth of expertise garnered from the thousands of alleged victims with whom we engage regularly. We and our organization also represent civil society as we are law-abiding, non-violent members of our communities. Subheading Relevant Background. There is ample scientific literature and other documentation showing that directed, pulsed radio frequency microwave energy is capable of causing pain sensations, impairment of muscle function, including that of the heart, capillary damage and bruising, inflammation and burns, eye damage, potentially concussion without blunt force trauma, called, quote, the immaculate concussion, unquote, by some medical experts, and various induced sensory phenomena like the Fry hearing effect, all in a remotely delivered fashion and even through walls, ceilings, and concrete floor slabs that are not well shielded against radio frequency/microwave energy. Pulsed radio frequency/microwave energy of sufficiently high power, which is lower than one might expect, can induce perceived buzzing sounds, high-pitched ringing, or complex naturalistic sounds by slightly heating the brain with each pulse of energy. The standing pressure waves induced by pulse heating of the brain propagate to the inner ear, producing privately perceived sounds via this effect. The prominence of this phenomenon among certain U.S. and Canadian government personnel stationed in Cuba who reported directional energy assaults starting in late 2016 prompted government agencies and the media to report those incidents as assault with sonic weapons. 2 medical studies found evidence of neurological damage and brain tissue changes in those victims due to this incident. And those studies are cited here. Swanson et al., 2018. JAMA, and I give the details. JAMA is Journal of the American Medical Association. And I give the DOI number too, which I think is Digital Object Identifier number. And then the next one is Verma et al., 2019, also in JAMA. Given the distinctive symptoms experienced by those victims, a UC San Diego MD PhD scientist who has extensive expertise in bioeffects of non-ionizing radiation recognized manifestations in the government personnel as being caused by radio frequency/microwave energy. And that, of course, was Beatrice Guillaume, and I give her citation in the neurocomputation paper plus the DOI number, also right there below. Over many years, militaries around the world have been developing directed energy weapons for crowd control. Similarly, through-the-wall radar devices, known as radio locators and intentional radiators by the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, are under active development for use by emergency services. Development of such technologies continues to progress in terms of increasing standoff distance and decreasing size. Here's a new subheader. The first subheader was background. This subheading says, dangers of assuming that only militaries and intelligence agencies are capable of deploying harmful energy-emitting devices for the purpose of torture and ill treatment. The assaults on the U.S. and Canadian government personnel in Cuba were actually covered by the mainstream press, though with much controversy and confusion due to the difficulty of collecting residual forensic evidence, because those assaults were carried out simultaneously against a cluster of prominent and credible individuals. Taken together, the military development of directed energy weapons and the assaults on the diplomats in Cuba lead most people to conclude that only militaries and intelligence agencies of wealthy nations are capable of carrying out such assaults. Yet, according to thousands of victims from ordinary walks of life, similar assaults are reported as being carried out by organized criminal groups within communities. Although this, quote, backyard terrorism, unquote, I love that term, so I use it a lot now. Although this backyard terrorism is now reported as occurring in numerous communities across many nations, ordinary victims universally fail to get media coverage, medical documentation of assaults, or police assistance, or their allegations are regarded as manifestations of conspiracy theory echo chambers or mental illness. While militaries, intelligence agencies, and certain sectors of law enforcement are certainly capable of deploying directed energy weapons against targeted persons with little or no accountability, it is dangerous to assume these capabilities are limited to such entities. The problem of torture and ill treatment with directed energy devices is much more widespread than the Cuba incident. The manufacturers of high-power microwave generators, antennas, waveguides, and associated radio frequency hardware, which supply components to military contractors, the telecommunications industry, and the medical devices sector, produce a massive catalog of commercial off-the-shelf technology. Components of that technology can be assembled or adapted into harmful devices, including devices to facilitate stalking, invasion of privacy, abuse, physical assault, and torture. The resulting directed energy devices are increasingly available to criminals through various marketplaces. Assuming that torture by means of directed energy is only a capability of state actors poses a danger to civil society. This assumption facilitates inaction by law enforcement. Side note, this is me talking. That's because, you know, when you say, oh, I'm being chased by the CIA, that's an excuse for law enforcement to do nothing because they're like, it's above our pay grade. So this is where I'm kind of going with this. Okay, anyway, back to the memo. Assuming that torture by means of directed energy is only a capability of state actors poses a danger to civil society. This assumption facilitates inaction by law enforcement, in turn facilitating the unfettered growth of a new mode of within-community torture and backyard terrorism, which are already being carried out with impunity by lone wolf criminals and organized criminal groups. With this background in mind, we comment on the relevant psychosocial dynamics conducive to torture and ill treatment via directed energy assaults and organized stalking. We also make recommendations concerning the prevention and mitigation of these activities. Side note, I wrote this on behalf of FFTI. Normally, I would have checked this with Ella and potentially others. Ella and I are the senior leadership, so we're allowed to do this. Ella gave me permission to write this on behalf without checking it with her first because of the tight timeline. Okay, there was no time. So I'm sure she doesn't object. I guarantee you she doesn't. Okay, there is a strategy to how I'm talking about this, by the way. Okay, so anyway, now everything you've heard so far is background. Now we get to what you want for an RFI request, for a request for information, for a response to an RFI. I mean, I know this from experience. What you want is you want your response to be what's called responsive. And that you look at the description of the RFI, and if they say we're interested in this, this, and this points, then you want to be responsive to those points. So that so far, that part of it is background. Now they did not ask for victim testimonies. Okay, so I'm sure, or I feel strongly, and I'm sorry to say this, because they're going to get a lot of responses. There's going to be someone that's vetting these responses. And things that look like victim individual testimonies are going to potentially get kicked to the side and not treated as what's called responsive. That's the jargon. Okay, so now the rest of this is so I gave that as background, and the rest of this is being responsive to their call for information. So the next section is section header, relevant psychosocial dynamics conducive to torture and ill treatment. That is actually the title of their call for information. That is the title of their report. They want to know, they want experts and stakeholders to give insights into the psychosocial dynamics that are promoting torture. Okay? Psychosocial dynamics conducive to torture. That's what they wanted. So under that heading, I put directed energy assaults are highly invasive and deeply violating because they can be remotely and covertly delivered to targeted victims going about their daily lives in community settings. For example, via devices covertly mounted on automobiles, or while victims are at home. For example, via equipment deployed in neighboring homes. This leaves victims feeling there is nowhere to escape the abuse. Moreover, organized stalking typically involves the participation of a large number of networked offenders. Isolated instances of harassment are distributed among many offenders, such that each offender may feel a sense of little or no culpability, because the harassment is distributed among many offenders. You see, I'm trying to get at the psychosocial dynamics conducive to torture. That's what they asked for. And I'm being responsive in the context of our issue. Both organized stalking and directed energy abuse are facilitated by advancements in commercially available technology. In regards to the specific examples of organized stalking and directed energy assaults, we identify the following psychosocial factors associated with torture and ill treatment. Number one, the ability to deliver abuse and torture remotely and anonymously seems to dampen many offenders' feelings of empathy and shame, which would otherwise inhibit more proximate and public acts of torture and ill treatment. So pronounced are these psychosocial drivers that many victims report their harassment and abuse as appearing to have no discernible motive other than antisocial entertainment on the part of the offenders. Factor number two, torture and ill treatment within communities is facilitated by methodologies that allow multiple offenders to make small piecemeal contributions to a much larger campaign of abuse directed against targeted victims. Psychologically, this shared culpability allows each offender to feel that their contribution to the torture is not immoral or criminal. Factor number three, when technology and or criminal methodology allow torture to be carried out within seemingly civil society in everyday contexts and in a difficult to document manner, law enforcement, medical care practitioners, and even victims' families and friends are unmotivated to provide services or support. Quote, institutional betrayal, unquote. Institutional betrayal of victims, including forced psychiatric examination and forced medication in extreme cases, magnify the trauma and harm experienced by the victims. Factor number 4. Unwitting bystanders find it extremely difficult to accept that such disturbing criminal activity may be occurring in an invisible manner in their midst. Accepting this possibility would destroy their feeling of safety and well-being. Owing to society's deeply enculturated responses to allegations of covert harassment and torture by means of futuristic weaponry, we should actually expect the criminals to adapt their methodologies and technologies to exploit these very same responses by the bystander audience. Okay, now the final section of the memo or the response. This section is called Recommended Measures of Prevention and Mitigation. That's also what his call for information said, to comment on measures of prevention and mitigation. The core issue underpinning the psychosocial dynamics conducive to torture by covert methods and technologies which leave little trace is the difficulty of convincingly documenting such torture for the wider audience of civil society. Surely, the vast majority of society would never want such atrocities to pose risks to their families, friends, and fellow citizens. With this in mind, we make the following recommendations to prevent and mitigate novel, technology-assisted forms of torture and ill treatment. Remember, side note, remember, he's calling for responses on torture and ill treatment in general, okay? So I'm giving recommendations to prevent and mitigate novel, technology-assisted forms of torture and ill treatment. Recommendation number 1. Establish policies that encourage member nations to comprehensively investigate allegations of torture and ill treatment by non-state actors, criminal groups, or rogue state actors, whenever a threshold number of citizens make such claims. I'm going to say that again. This is to the UN. Recommendation number 1. Establish policies that encourage member nations to comprehensively investigate allegations of torture and ill treatment by non-state actors, criminal groups, or rogue state actors, whenever a threshold number of citizens make such claims. Given the rapid development of technology and recognizing that harm can be delivered in ways that leave little or no trace, the motivation behind such investigations should not hinge on victims producing physical evidence. Recognizing there are technologies that can be used to torture in ways that are unfamiliar or intangible, or produce bizarre effects on victims' senses, perceptions, or minds. Investigations into allegations of torture and ill treatment should not be discouraged by victims' difficulties in describing their experiences as recipients of torture and ill treatment. Okay? Investigations should not be discouraged by the victims having difficulties in describing their experiences as recipients of torture and ill treatment. The burden of fact-finding and evidence gathering must fall on law enforcement and the state whenever a sizable population of citizens alleges torture or ill treatment, even if their allegations are difficult to make sense of. Recommendation number 2. And remember, I wrote this in just a few hours, no chance to edit. I went right up to the deadline. I was writing right up until midnight, and I had to work. I had to get up at 5 a.m. the next morning, as I do tonight. It's 12:26 a.m. I have to get up in less than 5 hours, okay? But I want to finish this out. Recommendation number 2. This is to the UN. This is my response on behalf of FFTI and Ella Free, the great Ella Free. Recommendation number 2. establish policies to encourage member nations to invest in forecasting the possible applications of novel and existing technologies to the torture and ill treatment of both citizens and residents by non-state actors, criminal groups, or rogue state actors. Policies to encourage member nations to invest in forecasting the misuse of technology. That's what I'm trying to say there. Forecasting the possible misuse of technology. As those technologies are developed, forecast the possible misuses of them. Okay? So the military-industrial complex is making secretive weapons and classified systems, but they're assembling that largely from an open source of fundamental technologies, waveguides, and so forth. It's the way they put them together that's largely classified. So there's this open market of technology which could allow any reasonable person who's aware of this technology, and it's used for military applications, and I'm talking about the source technology and the telecommunications industry and the biomedical industry, doing things like radio frequency ablation, surgery without a scalpel. These are all things that are out there. Anyone who knows about this, all of this, has a good sense of this. If there was the right kind of pressure or investment in really thinking about it, they should have been able to forecast that criminals would be using these things for targeting. It should be forecastable. That's what I'm saying here. Okay, so establish policies to encourage member nations to invest in forecasting the possible applications of novel and existing technologies to the torture and ill treatment of citizens and residents by non-state actors, criminal groups, or rogue state actors. When potential modes of torture are predicted, potential modes of torture seem possible. That's what I'm saying. When potential modes of torture are predicted, the same policies should encourage investment in the development of practical and affordable measures to assist ordinary individuals in documenting their torture or ill treatment in ways that have evidentiary value in jurisprudence. When potential modes of torture are predicted, the same policies that I'm recommending to the UN to encourage member nations should encourage those member nations to invest in the development of practical and affordable measures to assist ordinary individuals in documenting their torture or ill treatment in ways that have evidentiary value in jurisprudence. This recommendation should be motivated by the fact that criminals are often among the first to adopt new technologies for illicit gain, and that forensic science typically lags advancements in criminal tactics. Thank you for considering our recommendations. Sincerely, Matthew Arnegard. It was from the heart, this writing. It was uncensored. And it represents how I approach this issue. So thank you for considering our recommendations. Sincerely, Matthew Arnegard, PhD, Vice President of FFTI, on behalf of the amazing Mrs. Ella Free, President of FFTI, and our organization, www.freedomfortargetindividuals.org.